As I welcomed Dr. Nikolai to the peer review in rear view, we decided to add an acknowledgement to our disclaimer. In part 1 of this week's conversations, we covered 2 of the 4 major actors that constitute a peer review. I began by asking whether the identity, status, and affiliation of the researcher matters at the time of submission.
Largely, no, it doesn't matter. The journals and the editors of the journal look at each paper as it comes in before they distribute it for peer review. If they think it's worthwhile to peer review, sometimes they'll reject it up front, which means a very quick response saying this isn't suitable for the journal, either it's the wrong subject matter, or clearly it's not important enough to publish in that particular journal, because obviously the top journals have a standard and they want to keep that standard. So the editors will always review the paper first and decide, do we send it for peer review or not? If they do send it for peer review, obviously they will pick a number of potential reviewers who have knowledge in that topic, who are independent of the authors. Are they influenced by, who the authors are and the institution the authors come from? Not to a large degree. I mean, obviously, always one can't completely, ignore, okay, I've just received this paper written by a Nobel laureate. Am I going to reject it and not even send it for peer review? I think that would be highly unlikely to reject, as I say, a paper submitted by a Nobel laureate without looking at it very closely and giving it the benefit of the doubt. Does it mean that paper will get accepted after peer review? No. I've seen papers by Nobel laureates rejected multiple times. I've seen papers submitted by authors from Harvard and Stanford and Oxford rejected. And if you talk to leading scientists in those institutions, they have as hard a time as we do in getting our papers accepted, particularly getting them accepted in, the top journals. So no, there's no sort of guarantee that just because the paper comes from a very influential group in the biggest institutions, that it will automatically get accepted. And that's the strength of peer review, is that it doesn't automatically mean that those people get their papers accepted without them being put under scrutiny, like every other paper.
Having seen such a large rates of rejections across all categories of papers, those who are ranked super high to those who rank bottom but still are peer reviewed, and I'm talking more in terms of papers who are publishing research related to public health, such large rejection rates, are we over researching?
No, I think it's actually good that more and more data is getting published. In the old days, because we were relying on print journals, and they had a fixed number of pages, because that's the cost, was how many big each journal was. So there was a limit, and so a lot of research never got published. Nowadays, there are some journals that don't have a paper version, so they're called e-journals. And so they have no limit on the number of papers they can publish. They can publish 100,000 papers a year, because it's just all online, so you never see it all together in one place. The good thing about that is that means as long as the study is well done, it doesn't have to have a major, brilliant idea that it's proving in order to get published. And it's important that as much of those studies are published as possible, because it actually, each one contributes something to science. And so it actually strengthens science the more data that's published, as long as that data is accurate and the studies are well executed. I do think it's important that as much as possible of that material is published. And of course, at the other end, the reader, you don't have to read the hundreds of thousands of papers that are being published. We now can use search engines like PubMed to refine and our searches to only look at a subset of those papers. Or increasingly, we can actually ask AI as a tool to itself go out and look for relevant papers and only bring us back a digestible number of the best papers related to the question we're asking. And that's where I think AI is just super powerful to do a lot of that grunt work for us. And so in that setting, you can't be overwhelmed. It doesn't matter if 1 million papers are published. The AI can, as I say, go and look at all of them and then come back and bring back the ones it wants us to see, but we can then do our own searches and verifications and look at as much of that literature as we want. So it's not a problem that we have too many publications.
I should acknowledge that if I'm sitting in a journal editorial office, say as a editorial assistant or as editorial intern, I think that's the desk where most of the action happens, the rejections and the pre-screening. I think those rejected at this stage in the editorial office before they're sent to peer review are far more than the manuscripts that get rejected by the peer review. So I do believe that the editorial office is the key. And recently, maybe not so recently, there's big journals have now their sub-journals. Like a big name would have subcategories of journals which are slightly below the category to try to accommodate as much as the research in public health as possible.
Well, they've done that for a reason, which is that, these big electronic journals who are saying they will publish anything, in other words, they don't send out, rejections from the editor. They send everything to peer review and then publish anything provided it passes peer review. Doesn't matter the impact of the paper. So these are the journals like PLOS ONE or Frontiers. So they started to attract enormous numbers of papers of people like yourself frustrated that their papers weren't even getting to peer review in these top journals because they're so selective. But once we had these big e-journals who were saying, we'll publish your work no matter what, we'll send it all to peer review. As long as it passes peer review, we'll publish it. Of course, you have to pay a fee for that. So that's another barrier we could talk about. But essentially that created enormous competition because these e-journals like Frontiers and PLOS ONE were suddenly making hundreds of millions of dollars from article publication fees, taking all that money away from the big, publishing journals. And so they, to compete with that, suddenly realised they were losing all of those papers and therefore losing all that money. And so they created their own generic journals, whole tiers of them, to try and capture all those papers, even if they're rejecting them from, Nature or Science or Cell. They keep offering you a step down until you get to their bottom journal, which is like a PLOS One or a Frontiers, where they'll publish anything for a fee, providing that it passes peer review. So that was their way of competing against the big e-journals that were created.
Staying with the editorial desk for one more minute, I just can't, at least when I put myself in the shoes of, I've never been in that office, I've never actually crossed that. I've always been on the research side in the public health. So if I put myself in those shoes, it's hard to counter my bias that I might have when I see a manuscript that rejects the null hypothesis compared to the one that actually fails to reject the null
Absolutely, yes. That there are reasons for that, obviously, and mostly impact. So to be a top journal means you have to have a lot of impact, which means you need a lot of people reading your journal, a lot of people citing the papers in your journal. So the main thing the editors of those leading journals are doing when they're looking at each paper is saying, what impact is this paper likely to have? Like, how many citations is this paper going to attract on average? Because if they accept a paper that's going to attract a low number of citations, that will drag their journal down. And of course, it's a competition where every journal is trying to push its impact factor up and its number of citations up. So increasingly, the editors of those top journals are not really looking so much at the quality of the science even. They're looking at what they think is the potential impact. So a controversial paper, where the science may be questionable, they may actually decide this would be good to publish. Because it's going to attract a lot of media attention by being controversial. Whereas, an incredibly well-executed study that's very rigorous, that maybe disproves, some existing paradigm. So sort of not maybe doesn't achieve, achieve the null hypothesis, but really shows that something that was currently thought to be true was not true. They may not publish that because they may say, it might be rocking the boat, but, it may be good science, but, that might interfere with our relationships and so on. So, but I mean, a negative study, the trouble with the negative study is it doesn't prove anything. So because you could say it's a bit like a clinical trial. If a clinical trial doesn't achieve a statistically significant result, the first thing you could say is maybe it just wasn't big enough, it wasn't powered. So, if the trial had been 10 times the size, it would have shown a significant result. So the fact that this trial showed a negative result doesn't mean that the hypothesis is wrong. Or that there may not be, say, a treatment effect. And that's why it's so dangerous, and that's why journals don't publish, for the most part, negative studies, because they don't actually prove anything.